There are two metering modes that we're generally using for HDR photography, and really in regards to metering modes, it's going to come down to your preference and your own workflow as to which one works best for you. Now, if you're starting out with your camera and you're shooting in Aperture Priority like we talked about earlier with the camera modes, then I would highly recommend sticking to only one type of metering, which is going to be scene-based metering. On the Canon, it's referred to as evaluative metering. On Nikon, it's referred to as matrix metering. Now, what these scene-based metering modes do is essentially they are taking into consideration everything that's encompassed in a scene. Everything that your camera can visually see is what goes into determining whether the exposure value for your median shot is correct or not. In general, this is the safest metering mode because basically your camera is going to balance it all out for you. It's basically going to say there's this amount of highlights, this amount of darks, and it's going to find a median exposure, which is exactly what you want in an HDR image, is you want to find that median where you can shoot one in the middle, one dark, and then one bright, and capture everything within the dynamic range in that scene. So evaluative metering works fabulously well in Aperture Priority, and it also works well in manual mode as well. But for those of you that are shooting in manual mode, then you know that the camera's metering mode is only acting as a reference for you. This means that oftentimes I'm actually using spot metering. Now, spot metering works by basically where the center, say 3%, it depends on every single camera. But let's say the center 3% focal point, that little tiny area, is the only area being used to determine the exposure. What I might do is I might place that area over the sky or over some dark area in the scene, whatever I want to be essentially a neutral exposure, and base my median exposure off of that reading. This is great because it acts like a very precise tool when once again shooting in manual mode. However, I would highly recommend against using this in any of the automated camera modes. And the reason is as such. Again, like we discussed in manual mode, these metering modes are not changing overall camera settings, they're not changing exposure values. But in any of the automated modes, including Aperture Priority, the metering mode is going to change the exposure value. Meaning if we're using spot metering and it's taking only into account 3% of the image, where the center focal point is, on some cameras you can actually change it. But let's say it's taking into consideration that 3% center of the image, and if that 3% is over something that's very bright, well then it's going to adjust the median exposure to be very dark to compensate. If that little area is over something that's very dark, well then it's going to adjust the median exposure brighter to compensate once again. So it's going to give you very kind of wonky results as far as exposures because it's dialing everything based on one tiny thing in the scene, which just you might not know what it actually is. You might not know what you're focusing on or where it's pulling that from. So I'd highly recommend against using spot metering in anything else other than the manual mode. So in Aperture Priority, you're going to want to use a scene-based metering mode and then simply adjust the exposure value compensation to dial in an appropriate median exposure. Once you've gone over to manual mode, you can really decide whatever it is that you want to use to get the correct exposure for your median exposure image because the metering mode is just a reference. For us, we stick between spot metering and evaluative metering. Hopefully this helps you guys out. Let's go on to the next video.